Good morning. I am here to present some of my research on citizen participation in the context of citizen security or public security. Generally speaking, the concept of citizen participation is being used in a context of it's being framed in a language of duty and civic responsibility, where states are now beginning to empower their citizens to address crime and insecurity or crime and violence. And so it has emerged as a very important element in the context of citizen security. Generally speaking, it has been defined in terms of citizen control or sharing or giving citizens the ability to influence policy making. It has been defined in terms of giving citizens the ability to have a say in how policies are formulated and how policies are implemented. But more specifically, in the context of citizen security, it has been defined in terms of involving the citizenry more fully into the problem of security. The literature mainly focuses on how private individuals can affect policy, how they can advance how they can advance security in a collective way, the impact of participation on security policy. But the critique, though, in the literature is that most of the responses focus on the state aspect, how the state responds. But I argue that more needs to be done in terms of the actual citizen and how they perform, what is their role, and how they are mobilized to participate. Because somehow in the literature, it seems as though it's a given. You come up with an initiative, and citizens are going to automatically buy into the initiative. I engaged a number of security actors in the citizen security program in Trinidad and Tobago, a number of the community action officers who work in the different communities. And my questions were really generally based on what they understood as citizen participation in the context of security, how the citizen role was defined, and how they were mobilized to participate. And 3 themes emerged, which I categorized as the erosion of civic responsibility. So what was interesting about this finding is that they were not so much focused on articulating the role of citizens, but actually speaking about why citizens do not participate. In other words, the challenges that was getting in the way of getting citizens to become engaged. And of these 3 themes, which are state overpenetration, institutional distrust, and the loss of a sense of community and responsibility, the most important here is the state overpenetration. They define this as the state being so intrusive, coming into the community and taking over, and not giving the citizens or the residents in the community the ability to come up with solutions for themselves. One community action officer expressed this. He argued that the state has eroded the responsibility of this community and took away from the people their responsibility to contribute to their safety. As a result, the state's influence, citizens have ceded the issue of security to law enforcement and have adopted an attitude of docility, passive citizenship perpetrated by the government. This has led to the loss of creative energy, loss of a sense of responsibility, due to their dependence on the state. By the folding of their hands, you shall get bread from me. So this assertion tells us that we recognize that citizens have a role to play, but somehow they have given up their role and are now dependent solely on the government to fix their problems. The second finding, which is actually very closely linked to the first one, is geared towards discussing the whole issue of mobilizing citizen participation. And one major theme emerged, which is that of incentive. We need incentives to mobilize citizens to participate. However, the three major incentives that emerged were monetary incentives, education as an incentive, and spaces for citizen participation. Now, these spaces are categorized into two groups. In terms of community forums, where citizens can come and voice their concerns, share their ideas. And the second one, which was more popular, not in Trinidad, but mostly like in El Salvador, where they argue that social media emerged as an incentive because citizens can come, not only bring forward their ideas and their concerns, they can make reports on issues in the community and not feel vulnerable to criminal elements in the community. But today I want to speak specifically to monetary incentives because it's the most prominent in Trinidad and Tobago. Many argue that, in literature, they argue that no one acts out of pure altruism. No one does anything for nothing. And so with this in mind, we see where many of the initiatives in Trinidad and Tobago have always involved some type of funding. And this has somehow taken a negative turn by instead of advancing participation in a positive way, it has taken a negative light. One community action councillor from the Caledonia district argued that to get citizens to leave their community, they will always ask, what's in it for me? And when they ask the question, they always refer to what financial gain is there. And this was said in the context of previous programs that existed prior to citizen security, which one to name is the Lifesport program, which was a government initiative geared towards youth in the Caribbean, youth in Trinidad and Tobago, who they felt were vulnerable to criminal elements. However, it took a negative turn when it was used for other nefarious activities, so to speak. And so it's all about getting through. And getting through, along with other terms such as eating a food, are all linked to that whole notion of being paid to participate, being paid to become engaged in something that was supposed to be for everyone's benefit. And so one of the implications of this type of finding is that the government, first and foremost, since it is seen as the main perpetrator of citizen inactivity or passive citizenship, we are not to rethink the way citizen participation is approached. Not so much in terms of it's not so much as how to empower citizens by becoming docile, but engendering active citizen participation. It's not an easy task because on the one hand, you run the risk of being too intrusive. And on the other hand, you run the risk of being neglectful, because most of the time people associate participation in security as doing police work, and that is not the case. So we have to be able to get rid of all these misconceptions about what it means to participate in security as citizens, as private citizens, and then more importantly, in mobilizing participation, use incentives that are geared towards the greater good of all, rather than that of the private individual. We are not naive to think that because someone participates for the greater good of all, there isn't some kind of personal gain. But we should try to frame initiatives for the good of all so that all can benefit without benefiting just a few in the community. Thank you.
Happy to see the timer not having to lift signs. Good job.
Good morning. My theme is a bit different from what you heard now. I think the diversity of this table is not in being all women, but having very interesting different themes. I will talk about the human rights in the SDGs, uniting efforts to leave no one behind, and I hope to contribute to all these discussions that we will have. There is indeed a link between development and human rights. Today, we are not being able to separate development from human rights anymore, but there were some steps taken in history when that happened. The first step was obviously the Charter of the United Nations, which clearly pronounced that the achieving of development is closely linked to encouraging respect for human rights. And we had in 1986 a milestone when development was declared a right. And in the Millennium Declaration in 2000, it was also made clear that human rights and development are intrinsically linked together. Then the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which we are talking today about, is clearly based and grounded on the human rights agenda. There are some important paragraphs in the declaration on the 2030 agenda, which I will not read out, but I want just to make some very short statements. First of all, the human rights have to be respected when we look at the SDGs. No? So development is defined in the 2030 Agenda in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations to respect, protect, and promote human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction of any kind. And then the catalogue of distinctions, but also the word other status. So distinction is not allowed in any case. No? There's no status which allows us to discriminate against a person. The second mark, I think, that the 2030 Agenda makes is to say, because of that character of human rights, to not discriminate against anybody, that no one will be left behind. So everybody should benefit from development progress. The vision of the 2030 Agenda also says, we envisage a world of universal respect for human rights and human dignity, the rule of law, justice, equality, and non-discrimination, respect for race, ethnicity, and cultural diversity. And then the agenda lets no doubt that all rights are included, all treaties about civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights, right to development, rights of specific groups. So how does the Agenda 2030 embody human rights principles? First of all, there is the principle of interdependence. It means that all human rights are related to each other. We can't claim to have a right to life if we don't have a right to health. We can't have a right to education if we don't have a right to be alive. So you have different groups of rights are linking together in an interdependent way. They are related to each other. Second, the agenda is based on equality and non-discrimination, as I already said, and universality. All human beings, everywhere, in all times. I have handed over to the timekeeper here in the second row a document where you can see the linkage of every development goal to human rights, to specific human rights. So it would be very important when we implement the SDGs to have in mind that all of them are based on human rights. I only have put here the first three to show the intrinsic linkage between the SDGs and human rights. The first SDG on no poverty is obviously related to the adequate standard of living, to the right to social security, and obviously when we talk about women and children, equal rights of women in economic life. When we go to the more precise theme of what I am committed to talk about, leaving no one behind, the basis for it, the prohibition of discrimination in all circumstances, let us ask, first, who will leave behind? Who are the furthest left behind? Who are the groups who require a specific effort to get included in development? And there we talk about two phenomena, marginalization and discrimination, and vulnerability. These are two phenomena which are in nature different, but are linked to each other. A discriminative attitude is different from having a vulnerable group. Vulnerability means not to be resilient against any kind of hazard in economic, social, cultural, natural events. No? That's vulnerability. And groups can become vulnerable, although they are not discriminated against. Discrimination means an active attitude or an unconscious attitude to have prejudices against a group because of any distinction they have to us or to other groups in society. Discrimination is linked to power relations, and discrimination has a very bad effect in leaving people behind. No? If you are vulnerable, you can come into a situation of discrimination. And if you are discriminated against, you can become vulnerable in society. So these phenomena have to be looked together, but in a distinctive manner. And it should be, when we talk about development and SDG, it should be analyzed in such a way. So under which goal we talk about who is left behind. Actually, under every goal, somebody can be left behind, and not only generally. And that makes a difference. We have to analyze who is left behind in accordance to the goal we are talking about. Because the groups who are left behind may be different when we are looking at different goals. No? Poverty may leave behind other people as when we look at health, or energy for all, or employment, or climate change. No? And people who are not normally vulnerable can become vulnerable under certain goals. No? For climate change, for example, a farmer is not a vulnerable person. But when we talk about climate change, he can become vulnerable. So what action can we take? There are lots of actions, and we can be very creative and have to look at what is available in society as well. But I only want to refer to that there are possible changes in policy, legislation, institutional settings and service provision, awareness raising, capacity building, dedication of resources, very important, and participation and accountability mechanisms for these groups who are considered left behind. What is important is also to measure our progress, to have a baseline. Who were the left behinds now, and how have they progressed after our development measures have been developed? And when we talk about the results, we want to eliminate discrimination and we want to reduce inequalities. That's the further objective of the 2030 agenda. When we talk about the human rights perspective to the SDGs, no, we talk about the rights of specific groups such as women, minorities, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, migrants and refugees, indigenous peoples, which are in the conventions and declarations. And we are talking about identifying root causes of discrimination and inequalities, the intersectionality of inequity and discrimination. A woman can be discriminated against because of several reasons, not only one. No? And then implement human rights obligations and treaties and recommendations of treaty bodies, because that's one important point. States have obligations under treaties, and most states have ratified most of the treaties and human rights. Then establish and strengthen complaint and accountability mechanism. A victim of a human rights violation should have an alternative, should have a way out, should have a remedy. That's not always given in our societies. And if there is a remedy, it may not be accessible properly. The human rights-based approach, the human rights as perspective to development, is ensuring in the development equitable development for all population groups. And we should never leave that out of our sight. What are the challenges that we do have when we talk about human rights in development? First of all, what I observed, that human rights are not recognized automatically as drivers of the development agenda. They may sometimes even not be mentioned, and even though they are said, are cross-cutting principles. When you look at the documents, they are not cross-cut at all, but cross-cutting meant to say, yes, we have it in mind, but we have no clue on how to really cross-cutting them properly. Then there is a lot of lack of knowledge and information about human rights treaties, mechanisms, normative standards, and their implementation. Normative standards require a bit of study, require a bit of reading, in terms of not only reading the treaties, but also the interpretation of the treaties. That's normally not done. Then human rights education is not systematically implemented, not in schools, not in public servant professional training programs. Traditional cultural religious pattern in viewing human rights can result in discrimination, denial, and misinterpretation of rights. We all know that human rights in society often are seen, because of lack of information, that these are the rights of the criminals and the rights of persons who are lesbians, gay, or transgender persons. But that's not true. Human rights are for all, and there's an objective interest for all persons to defend their rights. But having rights, such a fame, it is difficult sometimes to talk about human rights in public spaces. Then there are commitment and capacity gaps by duty bearers, which is primarily the state, but also other public entities or private entities, who have responsibilities, or who the state sourced out responsibilities to in the health system, education system, etc. And where a selective acknowledgement and implementation of human rights is done. So I have three key messages when we talk about human rights in the SDGs. First of all, the 2030 agenda is not achievable without an increased engagement for the realization of all human rights. Secondly, it's only possible if there is an active commitment to eliminate discrimination on any ground and to reduce inequalities by building a new distribution schemes of social wealth that allow for higher levels of equality, leading to reduction of poverty and vulnerabilities. So no one left behind without human rights can't be done. Then there should be a building of a culture of human rights in society and in state agencies. Human rights awareness, education, human rights dialogue on sensitive themes, on complicated, complex themes where people don't agree. So we have to foment that dialogue and not avoid it. The dialogue is necessary to progress to higher levels of interpersonal and institutional respect for human rights and to their better protection. That's my three key messages, and I finish with that. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Please bear with me as I recognize my minister from St. Lucia, Honorable Sara Flood. Thank you very much for coming. Don't add it to my minutes, my greetings to the minister. All right, so I am going to try today to look at fulfilling the SDGs for children in small island developing states. And I want to acknowledge my research assistant, Mrs. Yanora Johnson-Coke. I thought she'd be here, but maybe she's doing something else for me, who helped in the preparation of this presentation. The aim of the paper is really to look at the challenges and prospects for the fulfillment of the SDG for children in small island developing states. And I won't read all the research questions, but basically I'm looking at SDG 1, 2, and 13 and see what are the prospects, what's the current status on these SDGs, and what are the challenges for fulfilling these SDGs. And I look at secondary data. It's preliminary, the findings, but we will see what we have so far, and we use the analysis. We analyze the data from the Jamaica Survey of Living Conditions 2014. So these are the SDGs. We look particularly at 1, 4, and 13. And 1, of course, is my favorite. We end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Very idealistic, but it would really be a wonderful achievement if we were able to do that. SDG 4, which ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And 13, which is becoming increasingly important, where we take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. So why focus on children? And I'm sure Mark will agree with me, our chairperson, that we need to focus on children because the children's well-being is the foundation of any society, and the status of children in the society will determine the prospects of how we fulfill the SDGs, and the future of our society determined by how well we treat our children. So I don't think anybody here would disagree with me that if each agent of socialization were to invest appropriately in children, we would have very smiling and happy adults, decent adults, productive adults, and adults who will contribute significantly to their societies, as we see in this thing. Now, the literature has supported the investment in children. I won't give you all, but I'll give you an example. For example, if we look at what the researchers tell us about investment in pre-primary education, we see if we do invest in pre-primary education, we are going to produce economic benefits. We are going to have higher rates of primary and secondary completion, higher earnings in adulthood, and lower crime, which is something that we would be very much interested in Jamaica in particular. And a research piece has shown that when you raise the preschool enrollment to 50% in low and middle income countries, the result of the benefit has been over 33 billion US dollars. And I can continue, but I want to give you the one about parental stimulation and nutrition. And if we improve that, we will see that we have a reduction in anxiety, in depression, in violence, and we increase earnings by 50%. So there is a very strong case for investing in our children, and UNICEF has already told us that if we do not act on those proven solutions, these are not things that we have made up, but things that have been shown by very rigorous study, then it will be very costly to the society if we do not invest in children. And our SDGs here is our focus of discussion for the conference, and we know that if we do not invest adequately in children, it will negatively impact all attempts that we are making in trying to fulfill the SDGs. And the SDGs are all relevant to our children, and we know that if we fulfill all of them, as you see, we will have a situation where our children will learn, we'll have safe and clean environments, and all children will have a fair chance in life. So it's important to note the relevance of SDGs and the importance of fulfilling SDGs for children in all societies. Now, children are vulnerable everywhere, but they are even more vulnerable in SIDS because of the very nature and characteristics of SIDS, and we have some of them there, which I won't list all of them. They're little resilience to natural disasters, fragile natural environments, high volatility of economic growth, small domestic markets, and heavy dependence on external markets. So we know that they are a vulnerable group, but they are even more vulnerable in a situation where they are in vulnerable societies. And children make up a significant proportion of our population, so we need to pay attention to them. They form at least a third of our population. And they live in a context where societies that I have given there, I gave examples of some SIDS, they have insignificant economic growth. So just to remember that this is a context in which we are trying to fulfill our SDGs, and we have insignificant economic growth, and we have high public debt, where we see as, for example, in Jamaica, where public debt is 132% of GDP. This is where we are. This is the context in which we are trying to fulfill SDGs, and especially for children. But we have to be a little optimistic. We have made progress since independence, and we see a reduced number of children, a person dying from infectious diseases, life expectancy has increased, general access to basic social services has increased, and the quality of life has improved significantly. So we are not saying that all is lost, but we know that if we do not take decisive action, our gains will be lost, and our current developmental agenda will not be fulfilled, and the SDGs will not be fulfilled for children or for anybody. So if we look at poverty and hunger, the SIDS that we are speaking about in this paper that is developing has not been completed yet, but we are looking to finish it. We have high levels of poverty in these countries, where in Haiti, for example, 59% of the population lives on or below the poverty line, and in the other countries we have at least 1 in 5 persons who live in poverty. So this is the context, again, just to give you a context in which we are trying to fulfill SDGs for children. We have very unequal societies, so you see that when we look at the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, we have Haiti, which has a high level of inequality, and the others are not very impressive either. And we have much for those who are wondering, the closer we are to 1 is the higher the inequality. So we see that we are not doing very well in these SIDS that I have put up there. Poverty rates, 1 in every 5 children is living on or below the poverty line, and this is the context, this is what we have to try and take them out of poverty. It's going to be very difficult if we think of the absolute number of children in total. We did a little analysis of the survey of living conditions, and I just want to highlight, I know I only have 15 minutes. It would be nice to talk about the children with 30 minutes. I don't think we should have only 15 minutes for children, but I will try. So we have a situation where households with poor children have a larger number of children, a number of persons living in the household. So we have larger households. They are poor, but they have more people to take care of. If we look at consumption, we see the difference between the levels of consumption between the poor children and the non-poor children in the households that they live. Now, when we look at the private investment in education, and we know the literature tells us, I don't have to re-emphasize, but literature tells us that the education is very important if we want to break the cycle of poverty. And we see the vast difference in the investment that is made in children when you compare the poor and the non-poor. And health insurance, again, gives us an indication that our children living in poverty are vulnerable. There is what we call a food line, which represents really the minimum nutritional value, the value of the minimal requirements that would help somebody to stay, or household to stay healthy. So when we look at that food line, remember it's a minimum. It's something that's calculated by PIOJ and statin. We see that 10.7% of all our children live on or below the poverty line. In other words, they are not able to fulfill their nutritional requirements, because this is a minimum line. And if we go across, we can see in terms of quintile that the vulnerability is increased, the lower that you are in quintile is 20% of the population. So the population is divided into 5, and the poorest 20% has the highest level of vulnerability, and the same is true for the rural areas. In education, remember earlier we spoke about the importance of investing in early childhood education, and we see when we look at the data and the expenditure, public expenditure on education, we see that there is less than 6% of the budgets in these countries is spent on early childhood education. So we really have to ask ourselves what direction we need to go if we want to improve the status of children. In terms of education, I'm just going to highlight some of the issues that we need to think about. We know the status of the primary school exam situation, where our children are traumatized with the GSAT, and we know that we need to do something about ensuring that all children have better access to good quality education. The data tells us that 70% of the unemployed have no certification, and we know that the passes for CXC and math less than desirable. I spoke about investment, and I just wanted to underscore the importance or the disparity between the poorest 20% and the wealthiest 20%. And I put the US dollar just to give you kind of context for those who don't live in Jamaica. The poorest quintile, their mean annual expenditure in education is 500, well, let's say 500 or 450 US dollars compared to the richest 20%, who are almost 1,000. So we see the disparity. Having said that, underscore the importance of investing in education. Extra lessons, I don't know if it's all for the Caribbean, but extra lessons are very important strategy to ensure that you do well at the CX11 and the GSAT level, and our children are pulled into extra lesson as much as they can, just to ensure that they have a better chance of completing and getting better grades. So we see that the poorest only spend 58 US dollars compared to the richest 20% who spend $217. What is happening in St. Lucia, and the minister may take issue with some of this, but this is what the data has said, that 60% of the secondary population in school is graduating without a certification, and that those who sat the mathematics examination, 45% of them failed, and those who sat the English, 35% failed. Given that I got a signal, I have to move on. But St. Lucia, again, the disparities between the richest and the poorest is very evident when we look at the multiple indicator cluster survey, a very good data set which UNICEF has funded and put there for us to look at, and the disparities are very evident when we look at the myths, what we call the myths. Climate change, the most negative impact of climate change will be experienced and is being experienced by SIDS. We know that. There's no dispute about it. And children suffer the most when we have, for example, a natural disaster, displacement, they have trauma, they have injury, loss of schooling, etc. In Haiti, I don't want to give you all the data, but we know what happened. When Matthew visited Haiti, 1.4 million persons lost their home and livelihood. The children, again, experienced the greatest impact. So, concluding, based on all what we have seen, we see that the children live in a context where there's insignificant economic growth, high debt ratios, and problems that we have seen in the education system. We didn't look at many sectors, but this is it. And when we analyze what is going on in the public policy arena, we see that there is obviously a lack of resources, there's some inadequate problematic coordination, and the data is difficult to monitor because sometimes we don't have adequate, timely, and disaggregated data. Now, we are going to move into workshops later on, and the presenters were asked to to look at the recommendations based on these workshops, so I have tried to put them together. I won't be able to read all, but one of the recommendations looking at resource mobilization, debt relief for SIDS is absolutely important. We need to get them out of that debt. When it comes to natural disasters and having to reduce the exploitation of women during that time, UNICEF has suggested more cash for work schemes. Increasing the minimum wage, and you can ask me more about it as we go on. There is a need for more data. Jamaica is doing very well. I mean, it's the best country to look at if you want to do proper analysis, but we still need more data. So we need to collect data on the multiple dimensional aspects of poverty. We need the data to be timely. We need it to be disaggregated by sex, by region. We need longitudinal data. We need UNICEF to fund us and give us some money so that we can look at what happens, the movements of people in and out of poverty, especially for children. Civil society, there's no doubt that we have to come together and partner very closely, and remembering again, it's an old saying that it takes a village to raise a child, but certainly we can spend another half an hour speaking about how our children suffer from abuse in public and private sectors, and how we have to think of ways of having neighbors help children who probably have learning disabilities, etc., etc. Capacity building, and these are documents, I think I saw it in some documents from PIOJ, where they need training in monitoring and evaluation. We need to be able to do some rapid assessments. There are over 161, I believe, targets and 300 indicators for the SDGs. Obviously, it's going to be difficult to monitor all of them, so we need to build the capacity of our policy people so that they can monitor the progress of the SDGs. And we are willing to help. We at academia are willing to support in that, in this particular arena. And we have to find a way to ensure that our children have more access to good quality education. Thank you very much. Bye.
Gender. Thanks. Good morning. Hard acts to follow. Okay, today I'll be looking at gender equality and decent work for female sex workers in Jamaica. Now, I'll be focusing on two goals in particular. Goal number 5, which speaks to gender equality, and goal number 8, which speaks to decent work and economic growth. I've highlighted some of the targets, just a summary to say these are some of the things that guide the paper. The rationale for looking at this area speaks to the fact that sex workers are excluded from social policy, which increases their vulnerability. And there are numerous vulnerabilities, HIV, AIDS or STIs, sex trafficking, violence, abuse, exploitation in general. Also, there is a need for more data and research to guide policy discussions around sex work as decent work. There's a lot of stigma and discrimination related to promoting social policy protection, given that the negative conceptualization of sex work, right? Sex work reflects that shift to speak to it being legitimate work, but prostitution historically is loaded, right? That's loaded and is negatively conceptualized. Also, there are various debates that support the various positions on sex work. As you know, recently in the media and in Parliament, there was some discussion about, you know, what should happen as it relates to sex workers, if they should, you know, be in the frame, the larger legal frames, etc. And there are others who based on looking at models that exist, decriminalized models that exist, believe that it is legitimate work, and as such, if it is decriminalized, then they would have more access to basic human rights, including labor rights, including health rights, etc. Right, so also, as I mentioned, as it relates to the models, that's important because there are various models that exist, and there are merits and demerits that we could take from in terms of finding some action points towards achieving the development agenda. All right, so the conceptual frame so far includes the SDGs. It also includes other international commitments that were previously established, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, CEDAW, DIVA, and some others. The ILO Decent Work Agenda that has 4 main principles, which we see some of the cross-cutting principles coming out in the SDGs. I'll get into the principles a little later, and of course development. And the main thing is that entrenched social policy for female sex workers and sex workers in general, but my focus is on female sex workers. Now, just looking at development for everyone. Development for everyone speaks to it being more inclusive, right? No one being left behind. So it basically involves a recognition and commitment by all stakeholders that all individuals are free and equal in the society, and as such should have the latitude to self-actualize through decent work. Right, and I'm saying here that work affords people to generate income and can assist them in leading a satisfactory and dignified existence. I'm taking a quote from the HDR, the Human Development Report 2015, speaking to jobs, income. Jobs provide income, it supports human dignity, participation, and economic security. So I'm saying also, and coming from the HDR 2015 also, that the link between human development and work is synergistic, right? And basically as the international community seeks to meet the goals around, meet the aims and targets around the sustainable development goals, it is more along promotion of inclusive development for all groups, including sex workers. And also the SDGs intersects with Jamaica's Vision 2030, which is towards development by 2030. So just looking at context, women inequality. So one of the goals, goal number 5, it speaks to women being in a disadvantageous position, especially when compared to men in the world of work. And the data suggests from Women at Work Trends 2016, this is an ILO publication, that women earn on average 77% of what men earn, right? And they are less likely, 27 percentage points less likely to participate in the global labor market. The situation is similar in Jamaica. Female unemployment rate is higher than that of male, and the data suggests from the ESSA, Economic and Social Survey of Jamaica 2016, I think that's the latest publication, that female unemployment rate is 17.4% compared to male, which is 9.6%. Males still also outnumber women in the labor force participation rate at 71.4% versus 58.9% respectively. Now the causes for some of this is multi-leveled, and it includes, but not limited to, undervaluation of women's work, discrimination of them, and the fact that women have the major child care and general care responsibilities in the home. Also, data suggests that women work longer hours overall than men, and this is even further the case when you look at the developing world. And I'll just pick up the second point, the hours increase for women when compared to men in the developing societies. In both paid and unpaid work, women work 9 hours and 20 minutes compared to men who work 8 hours and 7 minutes, right? So this is just providing the context that, you know, women are at a disadvantage, and this is even more the case when we look at female sex workers. All right, so there are some challenges to achieve decent work, and I will just look at the global employment figures and some other things. 30 million jobs are needed every year to keep up with growth of keep up with the growth of the global working age population, and about 470 million jobs are needed between 2016 and 2030 to accommodate the new entrants in the global labor market. So that is the challenge, right? And not only jobs, but quality jobs. Now, this data basically speaks to the fact that not only Jamaica, but the larger Caribbean will also have, and the global environment will also have these challenges. Now, coming back to the ILO decent work agenda, the types of jobs must be quality driven and along these 4 main principles that the decent work agenda outlines: job creation, social protection, rights at work, and promoting social dialogue. And in fact, this conference, I would say, is around one of the principles of the decent work agenda in terms of, you know, talking about the issues and where persons are vulnerable. So social policy should support decent work for sex workers to reduce their multiple vulnerabilities, and I had spoken about those earlier. So these are just some definition of sex work. The explicit and direct exchange of sexual services for monetary gain. The ILO defines sex work as the provision of sexual services for reimbursement or material gain. The review of the literature, as I said, is quite varied, and it brings out varied positions. And these are some of the highlights. In fact, that there is vulnerability among them. Sex workers are often targeted in public health and HIV prevention policy. There is literature supporting both debates that support that also sex workers have human rights, and the human rights framework supports them. Also, sex workers are a part of the informal economy. They are invisible in the society, and they have limited social protection and labor rights for them. All right. So this point is just saying that, in fact, sex workers' rights are human rights, and we see where Amnesty International supports this position, along with a number of other international agencies like the ILO and so on. Okay, so just to look at some of the voices of the sex workers in Jamaica coming from the oral testimonies, that in fact women have more challenges in negotiating work and in negotiating condom use, and they're more at a disadvantage than even men, right? So based on the oral testimonies, this was a publication in 2010, we see whereby, although their experiences were mixed, they basically said that, you know, these are their challenges in terms of with their clients, with the club owners, etc. Right? And I'll just read one of the quotes. One sex worker noted her experience: worst club in Jamaica. You don't have to tell a man round there nothing too bad. Him cut you up clean, them kill my friend and throw our body round race course. So that is highlighting not only do they experience abuse, physical abuse, but it can end in them losing their lives, right? And there was a recent publication in the Observer speaking about the case of a sex worker and the challenges, why she decided to go into sex work. But more importantly, it was underscoring some of the exploitation and abuses that she experienced, right? And that is general across the board for a number of sex workers. All right, so just to look at a social policy that would promote decent work and gender equality for sex workers. Decriminalization of sex work, when you look at, review the decriminalized models that is most preferred by sex workers, it focuses on occupational health and safety standards, right? Also, it promotes labor rights and those principles. And we see that coming out in the New Zealand and in New South Wales in Australia models. Right? Again, because discrimination is a feature that sex workers experience, especially in the health system, any model should look at, reducing discrimination within the system, the health system. As I had noted before, evidence-based research is needed on social policy for sex workers at the national level. And to strengthen the sex workers' interest groups to advance workers' rights, the workers' rights agenda, and this should involve linkages with the labor movements. There needs to be a collaborative approach among all stakeholders, especially sex workers, because it's important for them to help to guide social policy changes that will affect them. And overall, we're saying that decent work, along with the SDG targets, will afford sex workers the type of social protection they require, which should include protection of their human rights, labor rights, that will help this marginal group to flourish within a larger development framework. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. First of all, I'm hoping I could get all the extra minutes that were not used, because it's going to be a little tough for me. I have many slides, but it's really to share with you. You'll get to see them afterwards, and I'm really going to just summarize as best as possible through the presentation. This presentation is about the multidimensional approaches to poverty eradication in the Eastern Caribbean project. When we talk about multidimensional poverty, what exactly do we mean? We're talking about the state of being multiply deprived. When we talk about poverty generally and when we measure it, we tend to focus almost exclusively on the income aspect, on the economic aspect, believing that if we provide persons with a job, that all of their issues would be resolved. But from this approach, we're recognizing that persons are being multiply deprived and that there are separate, though related issues that we need to address and address them directly in order to effectively address poverty. When we talk about multidimensional poverty, it relates directly to the SDGs, and we see here at least 8 of the SDGs are directly linked to the multidimensional poverty approach. There are others as well, but these are more direct. Why would we like to measure poverty from a multidimensional approach? It is a people-centered approach. It recognizes the compounded effects of multiple deprivations. It looks at the structural causes of poverty and the gaps in access to basic services. So about the project. This is a project that was initiated in 2015, involving the OECS Commission, the government of Chile, and the United Nations Development Program. The government of Chile has been the main funding agency or funding government, and the other two are actually the implementers and facilitators of the project. These are the participating countries. It's also a challenge to make sure that we actually know our flags. So these are the countries that are involved in the project, 5 countries. And the main areas of focus. First of all, we're looking to build capacity at the community level. We're looking to provide advocacy opportunities, again at the community level, and to develop qualitative data collection tools and to conduct research, all in an effort to promote the inclusion of persons who are affected by poverty, persons who are vulnerable in various ways. We want to ensure that they are able to be included and that they can participate economically, participate effectively throughout in all aspects of society, but particularly economic participation. This project has had several qualitative research activities as part of it. First of all, a gap analysis, which was designed to highlight the main systemic gaps in access to basic services. Also, an identification of niche market opportunities. In order to do the capacity building that I mentioned earlier, the training, we needed to have a sense as to what are the niche market opportunities at the various community levels that would allow for persons to be effectively engaged in the economy. So we were not trying to just provide training, but we wanted to know what was there at the community level so that it would encourage persons to stay in their communities. Also, we've done qualitative research on the lived realities of vulnerable persons in an effort to use that information to develop advocacy and information and education strategies. And finally, this one is actually upcoming later in the year. We have participatory action research, which will be utilizing a new multidimensional poverty tool. So for this presentation, I wanted to share, I'm not going to go in too much detail of the gap analysis results because I wanted to give you more detail on some of the child poverty results that are coming out. So as I said, the information will be there for you. I actually had it highlighted so I would know which points I wanted to raise, but it's not being highlighted here. So basically the purpose of the gap analysis, as I said, was really to get a sense as to the gaps, institutional gaps, that prevent persons from accessing the basic human services to which they have a right. Identify as well the vulnerable groups at the various levels so that we know who are the ones we need to target and make special provisions for. This really is sort of the design of the research that was conducted and what it entailed. We're talking about focus groups. Oh my gosh. Focus groups, key informant interviews. Okay, I'm going to keep my head this way so I don't see her. Here again, we have a little detail as to the focus groups. We are mainly focused on males, females, and mixed youth. Yes. The dimensions of poverty. When we talk about multidimensional approaches, the project has largely been influenced by the Oxford University poverty research that has been done in the area of multidimensional poverty. But we have decided to extend a little in terms of the dimensions that we are looking at. We're looking at safety and security, climate change, education, health and nutrition, income and employment, and living standards. And here you have just a sample of some of the questions that we used in each of the dimensions. For example, education. We want to know what challenges do you face in sending your children to school. Normally, if you're looking at poverty from a sort of economic standpoint, we're interested in, whether there's access, how far do you have to go to get to school and so on. We're finding that there is really access, the schools are there, but on a day-to-day basis, we want to get a sense as to the challenges that parents face in getting their children to school. So that is why we are using this sort of qualitative approach, and the multidimensional approach is allowing us to get that sort of information. Safety and security. What are the things in your community or in your home that make you feel unsafe and why? So these are other dimensions of your life, the human life, that you may have a job and you go to your home and you don't feel safe. What are those factors that are undermining your safety and in effect undermining your sense as far as human development is concerned? Okay, so these are the main vulnerable groups that we came up with: the youth, women, particularly single mothers, persons with disabilities, and the elderly. Okay, so it is highlighted. So, like I said, with education, one of the things that has come up is the idea that persons are facing difficulties sending their children to school on a daily basis because not having the money, it means you don't have the food, transportation, uniforms, school fees, and so on. And then we have some examples of some of the quotations from persons. Here we see one of the things that has come out is the lack of parental value for education in some cases. One person stated, yes, they have schools in the community, but the parents are young adults and they don't have the interest. They themselves might have been dropouts. So to send their children is not as important to them. Some don't have money to send their kids to school. Similarly with health, we find that, yes, there may be health centers in the area, but the quality is what we have to question. And that is where we now have to go at a deeper level. These are the things that are now important. Whether persons have the privacy and confidentiality that they need, what is the waiting time, whether the doctors are there frequently. In all of the countries, we found that persons were complaining that the doctors don't come regularly, in some places once a month, once a week, and when they come, it's only for 20 persons. So persons have had to leave their homes very early in the morning to get a number to ensure that they are within the first 20. I think it was earlier this year, or maybe last year, in St. Lucia, there was an elderly gentleman who was actually waiting outside the health center at about 4 or 5 in the morning, and he got attacked, waiting to get to the health center. This is not right. And that's where the quality issues are coming in. So there's a health center, yes, but it's closed, of course, until 8 o'clock. But because of the way the facility is set up, you are required to leave your home at that time to be able to access the service. Generally, with regard to living conditions, we have the issue of poor quality of housing, water access not being the best as well. Again, I'm not going into detail because I don't have the time, but you will see it afterwards. Employment, the issue here, one of the issues is that there is skills training, but these opportunities for skills training do not necessarily translate into employment opportunities. So there is need to better target, better structure, better develop these opportunities. Safety and security, women of course have the greatest concern as far as violence and rape for their children and for themselves. Then you have the effects of stigma associated with the communities. Particular communities feel like when they go out to get a job, persons do not want to employ them once they know where they're from. And climate change, persons definitely recognize the effects of climate change on their lives. For example, the scarcity of food increases the cost of the food for them. And generally, we see that persons have a perception of life that is multidimensional in the sense that they see the different aspects of their lives and the different ways in which poverty affects them. Okay, I am now going a little to the poverty and multidimensional poverty and children. As I mentioned, there are various dimensions to poverty, and all of these dimensions, employment, education, health, housing, access to water and sanitation, roads and infrastructure, they all affect children very directly, and it affects the quality of their lives. Moreover, it also affects their prospects for full human development, and it has direct bearing on intergenerational poverty. Within the framework of this program, some of the things that have come out as far as children is that there is the exposure to multiple forms of abuse that is linked to poverty, there is child neglect, and there is a perception of children as a burden and contributors of poverty or inhibitors to getting out of poverty. Now, this has very serious implications. If children are feeling that, well, if parents are describing their children in that way, if they're describing their children in that way, we could be guaranteed that the children will feel that this is how they are perceived as well. Children of single mothers are of particular interest. that we recognize that the caregiving responsibility precludes many mothers from accessing training opportunities. Mothers feel forced to engage in sexual activities with fathers of their children who they may no longer be with, and other men for economic support. Increased number of children and economic hardship as a result of that sexual activity as well. There's overcrowding, which also contributes to sexual abuse. Within the rural areas, you have migration of mothers, and that persons are forced to leave their children with other persons or alone, and that too increases their vulnerability to abuse. And you have mothers who work in the tourist industry also having to face those issues. One example of the mother's views: the children holding me back because I can't leave them anywhere if I get work. I would have to leave them at a daycare, and this is money, again, I don't have. I cannot find a decent job. I have to do things I don't like to do to eat and feed my child. Men don't want to take care of your children if they don't sex you, but I have to do what I have to do. I don't like my child to see me like that. My life will not be better if I don't get work and make money for a longer time. Okay, again, the issue of poverty and education and how it affects children. We've mentioned some of it already, that there is the issue of persons are not able to access the services. You have other activities at school, for example, lessons or things that involve money, and persons actually feel excluded because they cannot engage in those activities directly. You have, with access as well, children going to school in a muddy condition because, you know, the footpaths are muddy. Effects of disability on children and families. Children with disabilities and those with siblings or relatives with disabilities are at a greater risk of poverty. There is a caregiving responsibility of adults, which leads to inability to work, and disability places added strain on the family income, a limited income. Children are often pulled out of school to care for siblings with disabilities while their mothers go out to work. Some experiences: somebody said, medical expenses take up all of my savings, and I have children going to school and other responsibilities that are suffering because of his disability. So you get again the tone of, it's your fault, you know, the children are being blamed, whether it is for their disability or just for their existence, actually contributing to poverty. Okay, so I have just some recommendations that are child-specific. The other recommendations you will see on your own afterwards. Parenting classes to encourage more positive forms of discipline and to discourage all forms of abuse. After-school programs to assist. Also, training programs should provide child care services to allow mothers to take opportunities for enhancing skills. And this is something that we did, or we have been doing as part of the program. Whenever we have any community meetings or training activities, wherever possible, we try to have somebody who is providing that care for the children so that their mothers feel free to engage in those activities. Specialized support for families with persons with disabilities, home-based self-employment options for caregivers of persons with disabilities as well, if that is what they want, and general psychosocial support for parents and children facing poverty. As I said, there are other recommendations that are actually showing the nexus between the policy and evidence that you will have to look at on your own, because I've been already told that I am short of time. Just an example here of somebody's poverty, experiencing poverty. It is a rough life. You can't get a proper job. You have to send your children to school. There is no money. Sometimes you beg by the roadside and the guys beg you back. There isn't proper infrastructure, roads, drainage. There are a lot of mosquitoes because of the water collecting. We have finished school so long and can't get a job. We try to hustle, but even then, we don't make anything. And I've tried to show you how this is the personal experience of poverty, and I've highlighted the main issues, and so that we could actually see the different dimensions of poverty coming out: the income and quality of work, education, health and nutrition, living standards, and I'm sure you could see others as well. And related to that is the actual capability deprivation, the fact that you've had those experiences and that it contributes to powerlessness, it contributes to limited human agency and feelings of shame. And I promise this is the final one, just to show how all of this wraps up with the whole SEN approach of development as freedom and capabilities. Here you have a woman named Angela. She lives with HIV/AIDS in Dominica. Though she has, that's not her real name, though she has a part-time job, she cites her infection as a limiting factor on her life. Although she receives assistance from the National HIV/AIDS Response Program, her difficulty in sustaining a healthy lifestyle is a major cause of sadness for her. When asked what she wished for her life in the next 5 years, her response was possibilities. That is, capabilities, the ability to do what you want, to dream and to realize those dreams. And so that is what the whole multidimensional approach of poverty is about, and that's what we're doing. Thank you for your patience and for the extra time.
If we can have the screens up, that will enable us now to get into our questions and discussions. But I'd like to really thank all 5 panelists, Julie, Rosalie, Audrey, Ashaki, everyone's an E except Birgit E. But I think they did a spectacular job, and they all deserve a big round of applause. Now, I'm not the moderator, I'm a chair, so I was told to sit in the chair and make sure we got through the presentations. But for those of you who drifted in a little bit, I will take 1 minute only to just summarize some key concepts and ideas that came up, because what we have now after that 1 minute summary is questions, very specific questions for any panelist, and all you got to do is say, I have a question for so-and-so, but also suggested actions. We're trying, the whole purpose of this session is to, in reaching the SDGs, how do we deal with these vulnerabilities? Some key things that came up, and this is not exhaustive, you know, there's passive citizenship. There are citizens who've given up, that they don't want to get engaged. We have to think about incentives. What can we do to provide more incentives? We have to recognize that human rights is a platform for every SDG, and we have to realize that there are relationships between all the SDGs and human rights. But the human rights platform is based on universality. There's no SDG, there's no action that isn't linked to human rights. Obviously, as the UNICEF representative, very pleased with the focus on children, but I think also the issues and the obstacles that were raised are huge. All the evidence from Jeff Sachs yesterday to everything we know, early childhood is where you get the best return on your investment. Yet, as Julie was saying at the end there, how do you do that when parents see children as a burden? How do you do that when communities can't get children to school because of obstacles that exist? So we have to grapple with some of those issues. Obviously, many issues related to vulnerability and many key concepts that groups can be vulnerable without being discriminated against. So we can't use terms vulnerability and discrimination as, you know, there's a whole group of people who are affected by all that. Not so simple. Some people are vulnerable and they're not facing discrimination. And a lot of that has to do also with gender issues, age issues, not just children, but people who were children 60 years ago. And we have to kind of unpack that to tackle some of these issues. Last but not least, the whole multi-dimensional focus on poverty and how to get out of it, I think is something that is a daunting task for all of us, but we have to remember, I think, something very important about the difference between Millennium Development Goals and SDGs. Everything has to be looked at with a multi-dimensional lens. You can't pick one silo, fill it with money, and get the results that you want. So on that note, I would like to open the floor, get one of these microphones moving around, or I think there's a microphone up there that can become mobile. And remember, the purpose here is questions to specific presenters and or suggested actions. This is not the chance, if you weren't on the panel, to do a panel presentation. So the floor is open, the panelists are there, and they will answer.
Okay, yes, yeah. Thank you, panelists. My apologies as I missed a few due to the competition, listening to people's in other panels. I was here for Professor Henry Lee's presentation, and I just have two quick questions based on observations in the slides. The first one relates to the overall poverty rate in Trinidad and Tobago in around 2005, based on that SLC that was done, and I saw 22%. From my earlier review, I think back then it was about 16.7%. The 22%, I think, is associated with the more recent SLC. That was done in TNT about 3, 4 years ago. And unfortunately, that's a sort of an unofficial estimate because I don't think the final SLC report has been released. So I don't know if you can check to verify the accuracy of that particular estimate for TNT. The other concern that I had when reference was made to the Gini coefficients and the inequity in the distribution of wealth, I was a bit surprised that the Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago were on par based on the estimates. So I don't know if there could be some explanation for that in terms of the estimates for the Gini coefficient. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Thank you to the panelists. I have a few questions for a few of the panelists, and I'll start with Ashaki Dor. Okay, so I missed the very introduction. So the couple sentences you gave, I missed. So I wanted to first say that passive citizenship, as Mark has, in his summary alluded to, is really a reality that has to be accepted in all of the citizen participation literature. Passive citizenship is something that the literature grapples with and accepts that, sometimes you just have to accept. Once people have adequate information and make an informed decision to not engage. But based on the little that I knew of Trinidad in the 1980s and, a little bit in the 1990s, I wondered whether Trinidad has neighborhood watches. Okay, so they don't, because Jamaica has neighborhood watches, and that's a way in which ordinary people get involved in public security, public security. There was a time as well under the Eric Williams government where there was something called, I think, Best Village or Better Village, and I wondered the extent to which that still exists in creating the kind of identification with a community and a feeling of village and community pride, and whether that still exists, or the extent to which that, some of that may have been eroded over time. Also, I think the nature of crime today makes people very afraid. Crime today is not the same as it was 20 or 30 years ago, and if people really don't want to participate, it could be, out of fear. So those I wanted to put on the table with respect to your presentation. With respect to Aldri's, Bridget, I don't think I had a question, although I was sitting next to Dr. Witter, and he leaned over and asked me whether anybody has done work on the hierarchy of human rights. In other words, do we have a hierarchy? He stepped up. Oh, he's here. Okay, I thought he had stepped out. Has anybody done a rank? For Aldri, you mentioned a lot really about the vulnerabilities that children experience or face, but there are also rights which children have, responsibilities, sorry. And I didn't hear you. I know you said the work is preliminary, but issues of school violence and children's participation in school violence would have to also be part of the examination or the inclusion in the work that you're doing. And in addition to children's vulnerability to things like sexual abuse and violence, and even their gang involvement, some children are, have to satisfy, as we know in Jamaica, the recruitment needs of gangs and also the sexual appetites of dons and so on. So all of that would have to come in. I want you to check on your percentage of non-poor who have health insurance. I think that figure is wrong. Health insurance coverage in Jamaica is no more than about 21% for the whole country. And so I want you to look over that. And then for Rashali, my question would be, what forms does sex work, take place? In what forms? Who are sex workers? What forms of engagement? It's not because, and the reason why I ask this is because sex work can become invisible or not manifest the higher up the social ladder you go. But there are women who, middle class and other women who engage in sex work. Maybe they don't call themselves sex workers. And that's something that, we have to add. Also, male sex workers, you focus a lot on women, but are their experiences very similar or different from the males? And lastly, Julie, in your presentation on multidimensional approach to poverty eradication, part of that approach, multidimensional approach, must involve sharing data with the population. People can't just be respondents. They also have to participate in conversations. About 3 years ago, I went to Grenada, home, and with Patsy Lewis, and we did some focus group discussions around the country. People were lapping up the participation in these focus group discussions. They wanted to know when we were coming back. They were happy to participate. They're not hearing the results of a lot of studies that we are doing. We have censuses, labor force surveys, school-to-work transition surveys, CPAs, SLCs, reproductive health surveys, and all kinds of surveys on school performance. And the country doesn't know. They are hardly, in the small island countries, in the small island, sorry, there are hardly any discussions, public discussions on these things. And the more we involve ordinary people in these discussions, I think it redounds to the benefit of multidimensional, or it could be considered part of multidimensional approaches to anything, not just poverty eradication. Thank you.
Thank you for that's a cluster of questions and some answers, and then we'll give the panel, and then we'll go another round. But also for the panelists, if you don't have answers to those questions, take advantage of Professor Witter, Professor Figueroa, and some of the other great minds in the room to throw some answers. But let's give this first batch a try, and then Ralph, you can do the second batch.
Good morning again. Can you hear me? When we say that as a citizenship is something that we have come to accept, I think that's one of the problems, because we have accepted crime and violence to be everyday concepts. We have accepted them as everyday concepts, and really and truly, we can't give up on security. We have to continue to try to engage the citizenry and to change the perception of how they are situated in the whole security framework. They are not just recipients of security. You don't just consume security. You have to be part of engendering security. And things like Best Village, those are still in existence. And those things are more on a cultural basis, and they are geared more towards building coexistence and building social capital and so on. But the reason why I didn't really focus on that is because those don't really deal with the whole issue of security as a shared concept. Those are still issues that are more geared towards encouraging communities to coexist with each other, so to speak. And the thing is, my paper sought to bring forward the whole issue of responsible citizenship as to what the individual can do on an individual level, as opposed to thinking our collective approach, because that's where the issue comes in. People are afraid of becoming directly involved with security. So we are not saying that people are supposed to do police work and are supposed to do the government's job and become engaged in law enforcement. But there are things that we as individuals can do if we think of security as something that we all can contribute to, rather than just being the recipient of this policy by the state, so to speak.
If you allow, I would talk to the hierarchy of human rights, although it was an indirect question, but I think it's important to look at it. Over 35 years since 1948, when the Universal Declaration was issued, there was a hierarchy based on a political order where some countries privileged civil and political rights, other countries insisted that they are not so important, and economic, social, cultural rights would be more important. Experience showed that all of them are important in the same manner. So in 1993, the World Conference of Human Rights, UNISON, declared that all human rights are interrelated, have the same value, are integrated with the same value with each other, and interdependent. And there was one example which was documented in 1993, which was an East African experience of elections. So civil and political rights, apparently very important, but and privileged, but it was an election during a famine, and in that region where the famine was, there was no participation election. No? The participation election was under 10%. So why would that be? Because the right to food is as important as the right to vote. So there was a whole movement to make human rights equally important to each other. Because when any right fails to be implemented or fails to be enjoyed, that's sensible for the dignity of the person, and it's sensible for the society. So we are stepping totally away from privileging any right over another. We think they have the same value, and if you neglect one, you will have a problem in your society. No? We can see that with many examples with public freedoms, but we can also see it with the neglect of social economic rights, which finishes discussing poverty, no? And how to interfere in terms of getting over some situations we don't want to have, like extreme poverty. So in the constitutions today, you still see that there are hierarchies of human rights. For example, Jamaican constitution has almost no economic, social, cultural rights anchored in the constitution. My country, Germany, doesn't have it. And the American constitution doesn't have it. The Spanish constitution looks more at basic needs than at the rights. So there are still many countries who are not acknowledging that economic, social, cultural rights must have the same value as civil and political rights.
Thank you very much. Yes, Heather, as I came from the podium, I sent a text to my research assistant and said something is wrong with this figure. And she did send back to say that the percentages have reduced, so that, for example, in the poorest quintile, we have 5.9% who have health insurance, and we continue in that vein definitely long. What the 7.9% represented is of all children, 7.9% have health insurance. So of children. So that is something. Again, when you do things in a little rush, sometimes these things happen. In terms of the violence, school violence, and children, yes, I support the view that all children must be responsible, and rights, we must discuss rights in a context of responsibility. But we have to ask ourselves, why do children participate in school violence? Why is it that they leave their homes and come to school and decide that they, get into some argument, somebody doesn't pay them $1 back that they owed, and they would want to stab that particular person. So I think we need to go back to the home environment and ensure that and realize that there are some vulnerabilities from the home that would affect the children and allow them to, or provide that stimulus that would make them want to take part in violence. In terms of Gini coefficient, trying to get data, Godfrey, on Trinidad is always very difficult. We can always discuss, but this is what we got when we tried to get data on Trinidad in terms of, that was the figure we got for Trinidad, 22%. I don't know if I missed out any particular, did I miss out any question? No? All right then, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your questions. Definition of sex work is, as you said, it's quite broad. It includes a number of groups, people who may not even identify as sex workers. But when you look at the hierarchy, the lower down on the hierarchy, they are more vulnerable. So most of the vulnerabilities are around the more direct vulnerabilities like abuse, exploitation. Some of those may be experienced by persons higher up on the hierarchy, but certainly the ones lower down, like the ones who work on the streets or in the clubs, they are more vulnerable to the varied abuses and exploitation. Of course, there's not a lot of data on the other sex workers who may not even identify as sex workers, who don't speak openly about their experiences. So that's what I would say about the definition in terms of the categories are broad. When I speak more about sex workers, my definition, I'm using a more direct exchange of sexual services, looking at groups like people who work on the street, people who work in the clubs. But I accept that the group is broader and it includes other persons who may do transactional sex, at their home or so on, exotic dances and so on. As it relates to male sex workers, the number is less, and in the oral testimonies that I referred to, there was only one male sex worker. His name, well, they used Boy Blue, and his experiences were different from that of the women. It showed that he had more control. He enjoyed his experiences. He was able to negotiate, where he had sex, what kind of activities he engaged in, and the amount he charged, as opposed to the other testimonies from the females who, so though it was a mixed group, mixed experience, but mostly that they had less negotiating power across the board.
Regarding your question on sharing the data of the population, this is definitely something that is part of the project. We've been doing so already, in the sense that with regard to the niche market opportunities, the research that has been done, for example, persons go back, the consultants go back in and give that sort of feedback. It's an ongoing process. And we also have, as I mentioned, a participatory action research coming up later this year, and that is part of the work that we want to get done, that not only are persons engaged at the beginning, but throughout and at the end as well, where you go back to them and you get them to analyze what exactly is the data saying, and get them to give that sort of feedback. So it's not only at the beginning. They will definitely have that opportunity to get to know what it's saying, to understand what it's saying, to give their feedback to what it's saying.
Thank you to the panel. My question is addressed to Brigitte, and you said something that really, captured my attention on the recommendation that you made at the end, when you say that to build a culture of human rights. and I found it very interesting. But in the same time, it looks to me also very theoretical, because we know that human rights violations are happening all the time, every day, everywhere, and the victims are the most vulnerable people. So after so many years that we are promoting this, whatever concept we can call it, so how can we move from something that seems to be so far so much theoretical to something that is much more concrete and practical? Because we know also in this region, in the Caribbean, there is a lot of violations, and most of country, there are no sanctions, and we know what is happening, you know, for us in the UN. So what is it that we can do in order to make things change? Thank you.
I would like to thank the presenters for, gosh, I've taken my...
Hello?
I would like to thank the presenters for what they've presented. Just a few questions, and I mean, I recognize that this is a forum dealing with the particular set of issues, so another forum may be addressing. First of all, to Aldry, Henry, we dealt with the children, and I noticed that we started from the education, but I'm also happy that in one of your responses you dealt with the home. But I wanted to go back a little bit, even from the pregnant mother. For example, lack of educational performance starts with low birth weight in children, where if mothers don't receive proper nutrition when they're pregnant, there's low birth weight, the child is a non-starter from day one and will not achieve his or her optimum educationally if we don't deal with the issue of low birth weight in children. I'm just saying we need to backtrack. And also, you pointed out the home. I have been associated with a constituency in St. Lucia for the past 20 years. It's the inner city and the home. Almost everything goes right back there. The fatherlessness, the lack of parenting from two parents, single parenthood is the single biggest factor probably when we come to poverty in St. Lucia. I mean, so I was just wondering whether in your research, probably not this one, but other researches, how far back do we go when we're looking at how children fare, how issues regarding even nutrition during pregnancy, stability in the home, health families, where both parents are raising children. I know it's not vogue to say it these days, but I don't need a study to tell me. I see it in my constituency, which I've represented for 20 years. The fathers that are in jail, and why is the children underperform, the violence, it goes back to what is or is not in the home. So I just wanted to point that out. In terms of, and again, probably Julie can speak to that as well, the whole idea of poverty, the fact that, I mean, women are there and they're not two parents working to feed the family. They spend half the time in court chasing the father to pay the money, and it doesn't happen. I'd like to ask Rashly, Michelle, what are the checklists for decent work? I mean, how do we determine that work is decent? How does it increase, I mean, self-esteem, makes people safe, etc.? There must be an established checklist. Perhaps, I don't know if your presentations are being shared. You have resources I might need to read upon to understand that. But it would seem to me that safety, the issue of safety would be paramount to determine that work is decent and it respects human dignity. I cannot imagine sex work being safe. I just can't imagine it. I'm just thinking, unless you put a man with a gun in the room to protect that woman, inherently, it's dangerous for the woman, inherently. You spoke of Boy Blue. I imagine he's a male sex worker, just a case in point. Of course he'd be better able to negotiate. He's physically stronger. He feels safer. It is inherently dangerous for women. I can't imagine it otherwise. Just understanding what the Sex Act involves. It involves trust. So if we really want to protect women, you will not be able to protect them unless you put an army man with a gun in there protecting her while she's engaging in sex work. I'm just speaking frankly as a woman myself. But I'm open to persuasion. I'm open to persuasion, but I'm not yet persuaded. Inherently, it's dangerous for women. And we should really, as part of our efforts to assist women, find alternative means should they wish to. You're not forcing anybody. Alternative means of employment that rarely makes them safe. Julie referred to women saying, I don't want to sell my body, but I have to because I want to feed my child, right? So there are a lot of women engaging in sex work who do not really want to. And I think government should start really assisting women to find employment that inherently keeps them safe. And I just want to just pose a question to the human rights presenter on the whole question of leaving no one behind, making sure that all enjoy human rights. Really important. But I think that we have an issue to resolve in that there are some human rights seem to be changing, evolving, certainly, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where we all thought we knew what human rights meant. As we evolve, new rights are emerging. And to my mind, if we have to achieve together what we're all seeking to achieve, there has to be consensus, there has to be universality. So I think the dialogue needs to focus on how do we agree? Do we need to make sure the definitions are clear? How do we continue that dialogue so that human rights are clear, terms are universally accepted, there is consensus, because the friction will continue and we may not achieve what we are seeking to achieve by 2030. I thank you very much, and if I do have to leave before all the answers are given, it's not that I do not wish to say, but I do have to catch a flight, so I beg for your excuse, and I would have loved to stay, but it's not out of rudeness that I'm leaving. I thank you very much.
Yeah, I basically have two questions. The first one is concerning public safety. You spoke regarding the stakeholders' approach on public safety policy. That is the need for citizens' participation. You described that sometimes the state is being intrusive and taking over. Now, people in countries usually have distinct cultures. And my question is, how do you achieve harmonization in getting persons agreed on public safety who have distinct cultures? And the thing is, whose hegemony? And that is important. That's question one. Poverty eradication. How do you enrich the population to eradicate poverty? For example, matching supply of goods and services with effective demand. What should be private goods and services versus the public goods and services, and where the resources will come from to enrich the population? Thank you.
We have 3 minutes. This will be the last set of questions. Then we will have the last set of answers from the panelists. And if we don't get to the suggestion of having a man with a gun in a room with a sex worker, we'll have to carry that to the coffee session.
Thank you very much, panelists. Just one question to Dr. Henry Lee. In terms of fulfilling the SDGs for children, did your study consider children with disabilities? I didn't really hear it. And if at all we're going to be fulfilling the SDGs, children must be attending or must be part of that education system. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your comments. As it relates to the principles or the indicators, the ILO has a checklist, right? And some of them is actually a part of the SDG number 8, goal number 8. But certainly the decent work agenda that I alluded to has 4 basic principles, right? And the four of them are social protection, social dialogue, addressing working conditions, right? So I think I missed one, and job creation, right? So that's the broader framework, which includes, not limited to, things like quality jobs, job creation, but also the quality of jobs, and those are income, etc. So there are principles that guide the decent work, right, through the decent work agenda. As it relates to how would one, or how would we as a society ensure the safety of sex workers? That could be one way, to have a man with a gun, but a more effective way, I feel, is to have an entrenched social policy framework that addresses these vulnerabilities. It's not just the abuses, but it's the fact that people know that they are seen as immoral, right? It is seen as immoral. There are no laws that protect, no social protection, no laws that protect this group. So when they go to the police to make a report, the police treat them with disdain and scant regard, right? When you look at the models that have been decriminalized, for instance, in New Zealand, you find that there is a better or an improved working relationship between the sex workers and the police officers, because now they are duty bound, not to say that they weren't before, but they are duty bound to take care of the needs and the complaints of this vulnerable group, just like any other group, any other person who would go to seek redress from the system. So I believe there are many ways, but one effective way could be through an entrenched social policy that offers protection across the board for sex workers. That's what I'd say at this point. And stigma and discrimination, we have to work around that. We have to work towards reducing that culture of stigma and discrimination. And one way is through policies around this group, right? And then we can continue to have that social dialogue around what needs to happen in this group.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. I think I skipped over the piece of research in my presentation that actually shows the impact of nutrition and parental stimulation, which shows that when we stimulate make sure we have parental stimulation and we have proper nutrition, we will see the returns of that investment in terms of less anxiety, depression, less violence, and higher earnings among the children when they become adults. Yes, I agree that it starts in the home, and we, in fact, the CRC, which I didn't have time to talk about, I did say at the beginning that I needed at least half an hour to speak about the children. There are so many dimensions, but in the conceptual framework that I presented, I did say that every agent of socialization is important, and one of them there was the family. So yes, it is very important that parents step up and improve their investment, their own investment, qualitatively and quantitatively in their children for us to see the returns of that investment. The last one about children with disability, in fact, just recently I did an entire presentation on what I call invisible children, invisible in the sense that they are not immediately at the attention of policymakers, street children, children with disabilities, children affected and infected with HIV/AIDS, and the list goes on. So yes, I am very, very aware that there are groups of children that are even more vulnerable than the children that we speak of as an entire group. So thank you very much. I don't know if I missed anything else. Thank you. I think that's it.
On the 2 questions, culture of human rights, I think it's a very valuable and important question, and I'm sorry that we can't discuss it further, but there are 2 layers. The first layer is the rights holders. They should know their rights. and they should be able to complain when their rights are violated, and they should feel empowered to do so, and also to do work for realizing their rights, because the state can provide conditions, but it's then on me how I can realize that right for myself, no? My plans of life. The most important layer is the government or the state. No, the state took a constitutional and international obligation to protect, to promote, to fulfill, to respect human rights and treaties. So, and the state has to create conditions, for example, national human rights institution, what Jamaica wants to create now, to create an environment where first the legislation is based on human rights, and the treaties are domesticated, which is not the case. Many treaties are incompletely domesticated because of the dual system that we are all facing in the common law system. No? Then we have the problem of institutions implementing these things. And institutions are created for implementing human rights. Policies and legislation have to be there, but also the protection mechanisms should be there. So now we have actually a culture of human rights violations which are not addressed, and the public does not fear that their feeling about violations gets anywhere. No? So a culture of human rights would have these both components, the culture to fulfill, protect, respect, and promote, and the culture of the rights holders to be able to claim their rights, to know about their rights. And human rights education is a thing, it's not attended. No, there was a decade of human rights education. It went across the world, but not through the Caribbean. So we have a task which has to be done. Then on the leaving no one behind question and changing human rights over time, there are two issues. Yes, human rights from the Universal Declaration towards our times now, yes, there are changes, but not in the rights. Their rights are still the same, but in the interpretation of rights. For example, the whole age of technology that we are passing through now was not envisaged in 1948. Also, rights of women, which have developed a lot, were not envisaged in the same manner as it was in 1948. There was no CEDAW. No? And women's emancipation was at the beginning. So for example, sexual reproductive health rights, related to the health of women, were not a discussion theme. And we can't say that human rights should not evolve and we should stick to what was in 1948. Because I tell you, in 1793, there was also already a rights declaration. Do we want to stick to it? No, we don't want, because our societies are evolving. So interpretations of rights are getting broader, are trying to capture what happens in society. And there's another thing to answer this question. Leaving no one behind is a movement during the human rights development since for 200 years or more. No? First, only men and citizens had human rights. Then the workers came, women, minorities, children. Now we are also including such groups we are not want to talk about: LGBT, sex workers, persons with HIV, persons we don't like, Rastafari. But there are so many groups which are excluded de facto from the benefit of living a full life because they don't have access to their rights or are not able to claim them or don't know or don't have any social protection scheme in place. So we have to live with it, that we are living in a changing world which brings to the table new challenges and which we have to respond to. And our response should not be, that was not a human right that was declared in 1948. Our response should be, what is necessary for ensuring human dignity for everybody of us? No, be it a person rich and nice or ugly and poor. No? So we have to look at everybody as a person. Even a criminal is a person and has rights. and the criminal only loses the right to liberty, and maybe some other rights to elect government, whatever. But every other right is kept there. No, there's still right to education. There's still right to health. There's still right to food. There's still right to hygiene and water. So I think we should say goodbye to a human rights concept which is conservative. We should say welcome to a human rights concept that makes our society better, more equal, and more just.
Thank you, everyone, because there's a right to coffee and a right to water. So this session has finished. The conversation can continue in the courtyard where there's coffee for everyone and water for everyone all the time. For those who felt parched yesterday, just go down to the courtyard. There's always water. And since this is about addressing vulnerabilities, there's an announcement that on the 3rd floor there's coffee for ministers. But I would suggest anyone who feels like a minister today or wants to chat with a minister today, have your coffee on the 3rd floor. Thank you, everyone.